Thank you, Megan, for that great introduction, and thank you all for being here tonight. I was saying earlier, this is really the hardcore history in St. Augustine to come out on a gloomy, dark night like this. And I know that you all know Herschel Shepherd, and you know that for many, many years he has been working with incredible enthusiasm on the Tovar House, one of the Historical Society's important properties. And it's been a long unfolding process with lots of people involved. I think at the last meeting, or one of the earlier meetings this year, you heard from Herschel about his architectural research and historical research. And we're going to hear next month from Susan Parker, who was done a lot of the documentary research on this. So tonight, you are going to get the archaeology. And yes, and I decided to put the thank you slide at the beginning rather than the end, because you may be really exhausted by looking at dirt slides and stratigraphy by the end of the evening and won't really notice this, but we were funded by the Historic St. Augustine Research Institute at Flagler College and the Historical Society with help from UF, University of Florida, and the City of St. Augustine. So thank you to all those entities. And here you see the principal investigators at the beginning of the project. That really means that we get to pop in whenever it's nice and can work on the project, get the money, do the budgets, and kind of general administration. And Herschel is, of course, the team leader. He is no longer allowed by his family to drive at night, so he couldn't be here, so I can brag on him as much as I want tonight. Slow way. But here are the folks who really did all the work. The team that did both years of excavations was led by Dr. Greg Smith, the field director. I think he's here tonight. And Janet Jordan, I know, is here, who has maintained all of the artifact processing for years, from the screen through the final entry of the artifacts. And Sarah Bennett, who couldn't be with us, has just done a masterful job with record keeping and working with Greg in the actual pits. And I have to say that of all the years that I've been doing archaeology in St. Augustine, the Tovar House has been one of the most complex and detailed archaeologically places that I've ever worked. And if it were not for the really meticulous work at 2-inch increments by this group, we really could not have sorted this out. So I'm sure, does anyone here not know the Tovar House or has not been to the Tovar House? Good, because this is just to orient you. You know, it's on the corner of Charlotte and St. Francis, and like, we don't have obviously right here, and until recently, there really was only skeletal information about the site itself, who lived there. The earliest record is on the Puente map, which showed that the site was owned and occupied by a soldier, Joseph Tovar. And in the second Spanish period, or excuse me, the British period, it was owned by a merchant, John Johnson. After that, the Crown owned and rented it for a short time, and it was in the Alvarez family for 3/4 of a century, until 1871. Actually, yeah, 1871. And not too long after that, it really became the St. Augustine, part of the St. Augustine Historical Society. So I'm going to be referencing room numbers, which is, I know, really hard to follow if you don't already know the numbers, and it's kind of annoying. But it's much easier than just saying the room on the corner every time. So for tonight, I think the more critical things to just sort of keep in mind are that when you're coming out of the museum building and into the Tovar House, you're coming into room 103, and straight ahead you see the fireplace. There are these 2 rooms here. And then there's another door here, and you go into the really big room that is along Charlotte Street. That's room 101, but I'll try to not use numbers as much as we possibly can. And I also want to beg your patience about some of these technical stratigraphic slides. I know that if you're not an archaeologist, it may not make a lot of sense, or it may look really strange and unfamiliar. So I'll try to minimize that as much as possible, but that is our evidence, and you kind of just have to believe us. But Greg Smith and Janet Jordan are here, and they can also answer any questions. And if either of you or anybody in the room at any time thinks this is completely out to sea, you just can't figure out what you're looking at, just don't hesitate to speak up. So the only map records we really have of the Tovar are the Puente map, which isn't really useful at all. It just shows a small rectangular building on the corner. By 1788, though, on the Roque map, it seems pretty clear that the building had assumed the configuration of this section. You can see the similarities. There's some interior walls on the Roque map that have not yet been verified, but between 1764 and 1788, everything but these two rooms had been added. So when we started work, Susan wrote a proposal incorporating some of Herschel's questions, and I organized some archaeology around that. But he was really interested in where was the east wall originally of the Tovar house, or when was the east wall that's there now, when was that built? And that's the first wall you see when you walk out of the museum building. He also wanted to know if that isn't the east wall originally of the Tovar house, what was. And he was really interested in this fireplace, right here, because it's a very unusual kind of fireplace. So to try and answer some of his questions, in 2015, the team, Greg and Janet and Sarah, opened two excavation units. The first one was on the outside in the kind of alleyway there with the cannonball wall under the window. And I'm just going to run through what we learned in 2015, because we have given a talk about that just to get us up to where we started this year. What we found, or they found, in excavating that unit was that the very first building episode that's evident archaeologically was from the British period. Under that, it's strictly first Spanish period, and there was no evidence of posts or walls or anything. What was really interesting was that the footing for the British period, the base upon which that wall was built, is only about 6 inches thick. And it's made of just, you can see how rubbly it is. There are loose shells and bits of brick and lots of dirt in there. And so we were able to conclude that that certainly was not the original Spanish period wall of the Tovar house. Oh, and the reason we knew it was the British period, there's very little datable material, mostly bones and bricks and glass and shell, but we did find 2 or 3 pieces in the footing, and there's one of them right there, of creamware, a kind of British pottery that was really made after 1762. So that helped us refine this footing to after that date. So the east wall rests on about a 5.5-inch thick footing of loose rubble and trash dating to the British period, not the original Tovar house east wall. Also, the team uncovered in this area of the excavation the stain from a well or a cistern. You can see it coming here. There's the British footing way up there, and it went under the wall. So it had been filled in and covered over by the British period wall. And we didn't excavate much of it because we didn't want the wall to fall down underneath it, so it's still there. So we were assuming that, well, maybe this area that's now those first rooms you walk into was some kind of patio or loggia with a well during the time of the Tovar occupation. So to see, well, that wasn't the east wall, let's go to the next wall in and see how that looks. And it also helped us look at this fireplace in the building that Herschel was really interested in. And this is where the excavation unit was, right here under the door between these first two rooms, and of course that's where the fireplace is. This is just after it was dug to show you kind of what it looked like to us and how we interpreted this. Right under the existing doorway, it was material from the late 19th century, the Von Balsam occupation. And then there was a kind of a fill there. Then the really curious thing here is that this was the British period footing, exactly like the one under the east wall that we had already seen. But right in the middle of the doorway, there is also a very thick, deep shell and lime consolidated footing that dated to the Spanish period. And we date these by the artifacts that are associated next to it or in the fill. And adjacent to where this would have ended was a really deep post, also of the Spanish 18th century period. Well, that was really strange. And just to give you a sense of how flimsy these British period foundations were, this is more of a close-up, but you can see brick, that's the base of a wine bottle, there's some animal bones in here, lots of shell, and lots of dirt. They just, for some reason, were not particularly sturdy, especially to hold up a two-story house. The Pratt team, or the Tovar house. The hearth footing, there was a slab placed on there to support the chimney, and that dated to the British period, and under that was a layer of kind of rubble and shell and artifacts that was also of the British period. And we got down way under here is where we first started finding first Spanish period materials, and that kind of corresponds here to where that's the side where that deep first Spanish period footing was. And here's that same deep post. So it looked pretty clearly that as though the fireplace also was put in early in the British period, and that would have been John Johnson's, the merchant's occupation. So we knew at that point that we had British walls. We're assuming, this is where we actually found it. This is where we're assuming with the dotted lines they probably were. We found one here in the corner, so we know this wall, some of this wall, the fireplace, were all put in during the British period. But what's this? There's a Spanish wall and a Spanish well. So we were going on the notion that that wall that today is where the fireplace sits in the Tovar house was the original east wall of the Tovar first Spanish period, the original building. But this was really strange. Why didn't it go over there? I mean, what's with the British period thing, and why would they chop out, if it was originally all the way across, why would they chop out a perfectly good footing and put a flimsy one in? So we started thinking, well, maybe that was a corner. Maybe it never went all the way across. Maybe for some reason during the Spanish period there was a wall turning there. So that's sort of where we left things in 2015 and came back, and Herschel, and we were all really keen to see what's going to happen next. Oh, so just to recap, the eastern rooms were built in the British period, enclosing the loggia and the well. Fireplace was British, and the thick first Spanish period footing extended halfway across the doorway between those two rooms. So we went to the next wall and opened a unit, a pretty large unit, right in the corner of the room. Here you see it. This is on the way, the exit that goes up to the administration building. There's Greg toiling away with rubble in the pit. This was designed to let us look at both this wall, a piece of this wall, and also to see if there was actually any indication that that wall hooked up. The first thing, you can see how shallow it is. There really has not been very much added vertically in that building since the British period, and was a really intact tabby floor. It was a pretty thick floor. It's about 8 centimeters thick. Is that right? And it was in great shape. This is a closer view of some of it once it was taken out. And it covered the unit. This was a later disturbance that had gone in there. And it clearly dated to the British period because of the artifacts and the elevations. But when we took it off, when Greg and Sarah took it off, we found an even stranger configuration. Underneath the floor, completely capped by the floor, we found a tabby, a very narrow tabby base of a wall sitting on a very wide consolidated lime shell footing. It was the same size, same configuration as the one in the doorway, but you'll notice that the tabby wall and the footing are not in the same direction. It was very weird, but as it turned out, this line, that was the footing that's under the wall, did line up with the halfway through the door footing. So something was going on here. We also, well, this is a side view, the tabby wall was poured around, they put forms up. And the forms were apparently attached to a post here that went all the way down. Apparently it just crushed right through that, went right through the underlying coquina footing. And that supported the forms while the tabby was setting up to make the wall. But we were still really puzzled about this. I mean, all the other walls were coquina. Why would you have this misaligned tabby wall just in that area so far? The crew took out a little section at Herschel's request of that wall and that footing right up adjacent to, that's the Charlotte Street wall. Looking out, if you look that way, you'd look at Charlotte Street to see what was underneath that. And it became really clear that, again, we have this really flimsy British period material in here. It's brick fragments, glass, pottery, bone, shells. That goes across here. Apparently this, of course, the thick tabby floor would have been about there and covered all this. Just give you a better sense of that. And if you're looking directly at Charlotte Street from inside the building, we could finally saw that this is all British period rubble and fill, and mostly rubble and fill. This is British period, that same thin, flimsy, unconsolidated shell mass that serves as a footing. And here is a really even more massive tabby and consolidated and shell wall footing. The west wall, the Charlotte Street wall of the Tovar house is supported by, it's still built on that. This is where this strange footing, the big thick one that lines up with the door, went into the west wall originally. So the original northwest corner of the Tovar house was here, probably about 40 or 50 centimeters south of where the room's north wall is today. So this was very puzzling. Here's the British floor, and across all of this we have our Spanish footing, another Spanish footing, above that the British bad footing, and rubble construction of that. That's the British period material. Again, lots of creamware, and there was a piece of feather edge creamware that really definitely dated it to after 1562. And this material from these associated with the layers and in these areas was actually more late 17th century than it could have been late 17th or early 18th. But the artifacts like Puebla blue and white maiolica, which were found associated, started being made in 1650, so could have been any time after that. And lots of Native American pottery in that area. And here this was after they took out the post. You can see how it goes right through, cuts through everything. But we also did find, or the team did, at the base of the excavation, a number of dark stains that contained only 17th century material. And it seems that there was a previous occupation, which is probably apparent to everyone. There would have been someone there even in the 17th century, but there are remnants of those posts left, but in the way we were excavating, we can't yet put it together into any kind of pattern. So while we were doing that, the city of St. Augustine, recall when they were working on, Carl was working on the Charlotte Street project for the sewer lines. And they decided to leapfrog a little bit to give us a hand and opened a unit right opposite where we had been digging, but on the outside of the building. And that, again, pretty much confirmed what we were seeing on the inside. And the elevations were really very, very close. They found this loose British period footing. I think, Tony, you were digging in that unit, weren't you? And then also the same, much deeper Spanish period footing, and it came down on a 17th century trash pit. So the original Tovar house footing was laid on a 17th century surface, although it could have been a little later into the 18th century. The British wall then abutted the Spanish one. It added a little section. So thanks, Carl and SAAA. So this is where we were. We had this strange wall, tabby wall, and the footing that didn't really match up with it. And Herschel's thought on this was that it looks as though that this corner of the building, this was the building at that time. This whole area, sometime between the original construction and we don't know when, probably after 1700 sometime, that corner was destroyed, or largely destroyed. And there was apparently a hasty rebuilding, which was the tabby wall. This was the original wall in yellow underneath. That was the wall footing. And the tabby wall was the first Spanish period renovation in there. So, you like to think that, given the closeness of the dates, that this may have had something to do with More's destruction of much of St. Augustine and the rebuilding effort right after that. Now, we don't know if that's for sure, but the dates really match up, and there could have been another sort of disaster that caused that north wall area to collapse or be destroyed of the Tovar house, the original Tovar house. But that's the only documented event we have that would account for it. Doesn't mean it actually happened that way. But it's a decent scenario. And so there was rebuilding in the first Spanish period. So to follow that out, see if, it was awful. It was thick and it was really hard to do. Carl helped us, a number of people helped us with that, but it was in the corner where you saw him with the mask, and came right down again on the British period, the same thick, excellent tabby floor. So apparently, John Johnson floored the whole front of the building in really good tabby all the way through. But then under the tabby floor was this layer of really dense, crushed, consolidated bits of tabby coquina rubble. They had to apparently raise the floor in the south end along Francis Street a little bit to get the same elevation for the British floor as we found in the north end. I'm not quite sure what that's exactly all about, but in the end, the British period floor was very level all across the building. And that was, I understand, was particularly awful to get through too. So don't cringe at this, but this is the corner of that unit. Right up here is where the door, that big door, leads out of the front side door that opens up the double doors to St. Francis Street. So again, there's the British tabby floor and that rubble subfloor, and then there was some filling, and there's a really deteriorated layer here that picks up. There was some disturbance here, but this is a Spanish period tabby floor that we didn't find in the other end. Whether it was destroyed when the whole corner was destroyed or it wasn't ever there is still unclear. More 17th century posts. But this is interesting. This is the lintel. It's a big slab of coquina right under that door, and it's clearly at the British period level. So he, Johnson also opened that door up and had a lintel. You can see kind of the yellowish and reddish plaster. We found a lot of red and yellow plaster in all of the levels. So the inside of the house at various times did have pigment added. They weren't really white. Sometimes they were yellow, I think mostly in the first Spanish period, and reddish in the subsequent British and second Spanish periods. Again, here is the deep, thick, well-consolidated footing that supports the building's south wall along St. Francis Street still. And this is even some plastered coquina block that we think dates from that, certainly from the first Spanish period. We don't know, or Herschel has not yet determined, how high up the original Spanish coquina walls went before the British started rebuilding. He suspects that they were pretty high when, and still, a lot of those walls are probably still from the first Spanish period. There's going upstairs is the next stage to kind of get some of that plaster off. I think you all tried to get some of the plaster off the wall for Herschel, but for some reason,
it's all Portland cement.
Oh, it's all Portland cement.
Downstairs, you said.
Yeah.
I think we tried upstairs too.
And that's all been done since in the recent years, but I'm sure they can overcome that at some point. So we also had evidence here for the 17th century occupation. So this tells us that the Spanish period wall footing for the south wall, it's identical to the Spanish period footings under the other spaces. It was largely intact within the south wall when the British took over, and the floor continued into the area, and the door in St. Francis Street was open then. This is just a quick view. This is looking east toward the museum building in that same corner. And there's a doorway that was open clearly in the 20th century. But you can see here that the thick tabby footing, or it's not really tabby, but there's so much lime and it's so consolidated, it's solid, goes around the corner and continues. This was unexcavated. But it seems pretty clear that this matches up with the one under the other doorway. So we think that that footing is also the original Tovar footing, but no one knows how much of the wall still is. So to support the room's east fireplace wall. And that was the original east wall of the Tovar building. And in yellow, you can see where the Spanish foundations were, and in black, British foundations. And they're very consistent in both their their elevation, mean sea level elevation, and the thickness, the composition, and their alignments. So we do think, it's only a sample, but it does look as though these were all associated for the building. And these show you where these various footings are, here, and there. So we had only one more place we wanted to confirm. We hadn't really looked at that wall much at all on the west along Charlotte Street. And this was another really interesting unit. We again found the British tabby floor, although it was really broken up in this unit. But there's the Spanish footing. It goes along here. We tried an experimental spraying of part of the wall to see if it would look more visible, and decided, it certainly does. This was the part that was sprayed, but didn't want to pull too much dirt out all the way across the unit, so it's a little bit difficult to see. But this all is the same as this. This kind of slopes inward. And this is really the most interesting part, this area, which is infilling. There's a window there today, and it used to be a door. And it seemed as though we assumed it was a door from the British period, but it obviously cut through, when it was put in, it cut through this British tabby floor, cut through, there was a remnant of a Spanish tabby floor that was not in this area. So either it went really deep, or it destroyed them, or it was, we still have to sort that out. But it was a later door that was in the front of the building on Charlotte Street, right where one of the windows is now. Otherwise, the sequence was pretty much the same and didn't negate anything that we had found so far. So, this is going to be just a series of stages of where we think the building was at different time periods, just based on the archaeology. I'm skipping the real phase one, which would have been the wooden 17th century building. We just don't have enough pieces of it to parse it out. But the red lines are where we pretty much determined that 18th century or late 17th century Spanish wall footings were put. And that encompasses that first room. It's really pretty much that one room at the corner of St. Francis and Charlotte Street. And there was a loggia to the east toward the museum and a well during the Tovar House period. Now, we're assuming that this yellow footing, the Spanish footing, is the original north wall of the building. Then sometime also during the first Spanish period, and probably early in the first Spanish period, that wall went down, and this wall, the tabby wall, went up. But it didn't really change the configuration of the room, which even today, it's not a square building, and the rooms aren't particularly square. So the third stage, when the British came in, that's the black foundation. So they used the existing Spanish footings, but made this their building. They added these. We haven't looked at this wall, but I'm guessing it's probably about the same as this other British period flimsy footings. And they added the fireplace, and the black areas are where we've actually found those really flimsy Spanish footings supporting the walls. And that was John Johnson, who really did most of the renovation. Most of the renovation and changes in the floor plan and structure were done during the British period, even though that was stage 3. And then stage 4, sometime after 1788, because that's when the Roque map was made, and you recall that the Roque map was just this part of the building. And before 1864, which was when a photograph was taken by a coolie of the building, and they could see actually the building itself, sometime in there, this section was added, which is the current north, this is the north end of the building right now. So you had here, let's see, at least here, the Spanish, British, and Second Spanish period and later and present walls were all the same. We don't know how far up though. This is just approximately where the house would have been in stage 4. And it's pretty much the way it is today. It hasn't really changed. And I haven't mentioned artifacts except as dating. And really, when you're inside a building like this doing architectural work, the artifacts, we don't really know exactly where they came from. Most of them are from fill layers in between building episodes to raise the floor. So we're not really certain. We presumably got them in the same lot, but we aren't certain. But the things that we have found, this is just a tiny sample, do cover all of the periods of occupation that we've been able to document there. And I know Janet's looked at every single one of them. Some of the more interesting ones for Herschel were the painted plaster, and there's a lot of that, and a red painted plaster, a pintle hinge, and what may be a door handle that those date from the Tovar occupation. From the well, there were a number of interesting, we do know those were Tovar items. A marble gaming disc. We've also pushed from various periods, but again, unfortunately, we can't really tie them to specific people because they were brought in from somewhere else. But probably the most evocative item is this teeny bone. It's only less than an inch tall. It's an amulet carved of polished bone of a figa, which was a common Spanish symbol to ward off the evil eye. They were really widespread around St. Augustine. You find them in most many Spanish households. And this is really just a lovely little piece. But there's just one more sort of observation to the Tovar story. This is Labor Day weekend of 2015. You probably remember that it was just torrential rains, a nor'easter, the supermoon, everything was happening with water. And this is what happened inside that unit that was under the door. This is all like sea foam and sludge. This is water. You can see that the British period footing just fell into the unit. It had to be refilled really fast, or should have been. But the Spanish period footing stayed intact, even though underneath it, that's just a void. And this is similar to what happened at the Fornell House a number of years ago, when not so much from water, but because there was no support around the building for this really flimsy foundation, and it sagged and cracked. So this is not, there was no water in the building. This is not a hurricane issue. This is all water that came up from the ground. I'm not sure what anyone can do about it except not dig holes. You can avoid it near your walls, but it's more than just a storm issue. The rising sea level is truly impacting these buildings in ways that I think will probably be a lot worse for the British period structures than for the original Spanish period stone structures. And this will be continued, I hope, on the second floor. Susan Parker is doing ongoing documentary research, and we'll hear about that. She's found out a lot more about the family previous even to the Tovar occupation, that you'll have to come here to talk to learn about. Some of you may remember when Henry Grisson Meyer was here doing dendrochronological studies of the beams, the floor joists for the second floor. Herschel was very interested in he thought probably the second floor was also added in the British period by John Johnson. But unfortunately, the beams were all, it turns out the ones that were sampled were made of juniper, and they can't really be dated through dendrochronology. You have to have a library, and the library for the southeast is a forest near the Florida-Georgia border, but it's all pine and some cypress. And no one's ever studied the growth rings of juniper to figure out, they can tell what year these trees were cut by looking at the growth rings. Once they've done all these, looking at hundreds and hundreds of trees going from the present back. But that may be continuing. They're pretty excited about looking at some of them under the oldest house, if that's ever possible. And of course, Herschel is continuing his project, and it's going to be up to him. He's going to pull it all together, and this will be one of the very best known houses in St. Augustine. So thank you all for coming.